Derby preps, North Carolina breds, and some big news down in South Florida. All in this episode of the Win Play Show. Salutations and welcome, friends. My name is Matthew DeSantis. You can find me on Twitter at the handle @FailedToMenace. And thank you so much for tuning into the Win Play Show, a program devoted to all things horse racing, handicapping, and betting here on the NYRA Bets YouTube channel. Before we get into this jam-packed episode, I want to remind you to press that subscribe button here on NYRA Bets YouTube. Today, we have loads of content, whether it's race previews, full card analyses, specialty video content, or handicapping and betting tutorials to make sure you are a better horse player in 2025. Now, listen, we have a huge week to recap from last weekend with the Holy Bull at Gulfstream Park, the Robert B. Lewis at Santa Anita, the Withers up in New York, had the Oaks preps as well. Myself and Kaylee Shapiro are going to be doing a deeper dive into that tomorrow. We're going to be touching on some of that today, though, as well. And then, hey, make sure to stick around. Watch Snowbirds, a show with myself and Acacia Clement coming out on Thursday. It's going to be looking at the Tampa card, and I'll be doing a whole episode on capping the card for Tampa Bay Downs for those Saturday races. So whether you're into race previews, full card analyses, we got you covered here. Press that subscribe button, entirely free of cost. All right. Well, like I said, it was a big weekend here in New York, obviously with the Withers prep for the Kentucky Derby, but we also saw some really big efforts. And we'll start down at Gulfstream Park in the Holy Bull. And that was a really interesting race because you saw the two horses that were last out maiden winners, Burnham Square and Tappan Street, really put on a little bit of a show and kind of separate themselves from the rest of that group, earning 90-plus Beyer speed figures, looking really good that day. And, of course, the big names coming into that race were Ferocious and Guns Loaded. Ferocious, of course, was that horse, $1.3 million son of Flatter, who had the same connections as Mage from 2 years ago in terms of being trained by Gustavo Delgado. Ramiro Restrepo, a major part of the ownership group there. And that's a horse that really dazzled in debut in Saratoga. Ran, I thought, a huge race in the hopeful against Chancer McPatrick after that horse looked done at the top of the stretch and then re-rallied with Chancer to finish a really close second. And then Chase Lone Speed against East Avenue in the Breeders' Futurity. I didn't think the horse had done really anything wrong at that point. I didn't pick him to win that day. I had Tappan Street as my top selection in the Holy Bull, but I still thought Ferocious would run a little bit better than he did. Admittedly, you look back and you go, well, listen, he only had 3 workouts leading up to this race. Maybe he wasn't fully cranked. The Gattos even said he was about 80%, but they also said that last year or 2 years ago with Mage going into the Haskell. And I think, again, it just depends on kind of how you want to interpret this. It is interesting. He got the blinkers added that it did Ferocious, and yet he still had trouble into that first turn. Javier Castellano had to kind of slam on the brakes. He didn't get the most comfortable trip on the inside. And again, one of the things Kaylee and I both talked about last week when we were previewing this race was just get this horse out of trouble. I mean, I think you can question whether or not he wants to get the 2 turns at this point. I think that's a legitimate question to ask, but I would rather see him on the front end getting the trip maybe that he wants in order to really determine the answer to that question. Nevertheless, Ferocious didn't really fire his race. Guns Loaded started backing up around the turn, which was what I was afraid of. I know that he's a gun runner out of a Bernardini mare, $800,000 sale. I really like trainer Jose D'Angelo a lot, but that effort in the Mucho Macho Man where he was losing ground late, still hanging on to win, made me think he was not going to get the 2 turns, and he really didn't. But like I said, Burnham Square, Tappan Street, both putting on a big effort, and you got to feel good for trainer Ian Wilkes, who trains Burnham Square. You like to see smaller trainers or not your traditional trainers on the Kentucky Derby trail. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But Tappan Street, I thought, still ran a big race. I thought Pete Aiello called it perfectly. Tappan Street fired, but was just second best. And I think that's, if you were a backer of Tappan Street, that's probably how you have to view it. I think that's a horse that you obviously can continue to look at moving forward, maybe in the Fountain of Youth, because he did a little bit more of the dirty work up front, traveled wide. Louis Saez really had to get after him a lot of the race. So I think a very educational effort for a horse like Tappan Street that had only had 1 race prior to that. Now, you come up here to New York, and what do we see? Captain Cook. And big effort from Captain Cook. 94 Beyer speed figure. Son of Practical Joke really ran a big race and put away the other front end speed. No problem at all. Pulled away with ease. And I thought really ran a big race, earned a nice Beyer speed figure for that effort for trainer Rick Dutrow Jr. It is interesting to see how the landscape of New York is going to look in the coming weeks and months with the Gotham and the Wood. Because one of the things is we saw a horse like Poster, who won the Jerome, he's running in the Sam F. Davis. Horse like Sand Devil for Linda Rice. A lot of people thought that horse might go to the Withers, might go to the Jerome, still might go to the Jerome because it's a one-turn mile. But interestingly enough, entered this weekend in the Damon Runyon Stakes up here in New York. So maybe that's a prep for the Jerome. We're just going to have to wait and see. The really unique nature of that race being a one-turn mile might allow a horse like, even last year, we saw a horse like Deterministic get the win there in the Jerome, qualify for the Kentucky Derby. So maybe Linda is waiting to unveil that one in a Derby prep next month. But going to be interesting to see what that looks like. And listen, I think it's only fair to address the elephant in the room, which is that Rick Dutrow Jr., a trainer that's coming back from a 10-year suspension in the sport, now suddenly has a horse in the Kentucky Derby Trail. The same year that Bob Baffert, after serving a 3-year suspension, is coming back and has horses entering at Churchill Downs for the Kentucky Derby. Listen, it's not to insinuate one thing or the other, but to talk about the fact that from a media perspective, these are going to be storylines that people are going to talk about going into those races. And one of the things that we in horse racing are not particularly adept at is developing storylines. And we often let outside media dictate the storylines of this sport. And I think you'd be foolish if you don't think a horse like Captain Cook, if he makes it to the starting gate of the Kentucky Derby, there's going to be a lot of stories about Rick Dutrow Jr.'s past, that suspension, etc. You know that the Baffert's return from suspension is going to be a massive storyline. And so, again, just thinking about the marquee race in our sport, and two of the potential storylines in that race are going to be about something maybe less than savory, or that doesn't necessarily reflect the best light on horse racing. So again, things to think about, things to consider. We're still well out. Captain Cook only earned 20 points. That's not nearly enough to get into the starting gate of the Kentucky Derby, but certainly looks like a pretty serious horse, especially if Rick Dutrow Jr. keeps him up here in New York. Now out west in the Robert B. Lewis Citizen Bull, listen, that was a paid workout for all the Baffert horses. Citizen Bull, Rodriguez, Matticat Street, those three just, looked, or Matticat Road, I should say. Those three just looked really good. Citizen Bull, just, what a good horse. Just gets out up front, just goes. I think, Kaylee and I are going to have some more thoughts on that horse as we talk about it tomorrow on the road to the Derby and Oaks Prep. I think we both have maybe some reservations moving forward, but you can't deny that this is a really nice horse that just keeps piling up wins too, especially with Martin Garcia aboard. And obviously field size was a major issue there. The fact that Rodriguez really flanked Citizen Bull that whole way. I think a lot of people assumed Rodriguez would go out up front. No, Citizen Bull instead gets the lead and just kind of goes around in a circle. And that's one of the things I mentioned in my analysis, because I know a lot of people thought Matticat Road could sit the right sort of trip behind the speed. Theoretically, yes. But I've seen enough Derby preps in California to know it's a merry-go-round out there a lot of times. You get up on the front end and nobody's passing anybody. And especially in these Derby two-turn races, it really, coming from well back, is a little bit of a challenge. Obviously, though, everybody's going to be excited to see where does Barnes run next, right? Where does Romanesque run next? Where does Citizen Bull run next? There's a lot of questions out there for those Baffert runners that we're really excited to see. So can't wait for that. And then listen, on the female side, we had two Oaks preps. The Forward Gallo, just talk very briefly. Brad Cox exacta in that one with Eclatant and Stunner. But Cox afterwards was talking to Ahante's 305, really good show and really good programming on Twitter, if you're not familiar. But he was talking to him and said, I think they're going to stay around one turn. So, yes, it was an Oaks prep, but don't expect these horses to be on the Oaks Trail necessarily. One horse that's definitely on the Oaks Trail, Tenma. I'm not going to say much about this. I'll let my colleague Kaylee Shapiro talk about this tomorrow because she loves this horse, and understandably so. A huge effort from Tenma, and she's a very, very, very serious filly to go up against, presumably, the Brad Cox duo of Good Cheer and Muhima. We're excited to see all of them. That Oaks picture is really shaping up to be a pretty nice group this year. So excited for that. A lot of great stuff there on the Oaks and Derby Trail from this past weekend. Now, listen, another big thing from this past weekend is I got to give a shout out to North Carolina. Used to live there. I lived there for 8 years. Loved me some Cookout. Loved me some Biscuitville. Loved me some Lexington barbecue. Listen, I love North Carolina. And North Carolina is good horse country. Good horse people there. A lot of great people I know in the fox hunting community down in North Carolina, off-track thoroughbred programs, etc. But they're not necessarily known for their breeding. Well, it might change a little bit. Horse named Volleyball Princess won the Ruthless this weekend up here at Aqueduct by 10 lengths. And she, if you looked at the past performances and looked at the entries, North Carolina bred. You don't see many of those. And that's not just me saying that. In fact, she is one of only 4 North Carolina breds in her entire foal crop for 2022. So she is a rarity to see. And you don't see many North Carolina breds. It's really great to see those smaller state bred horses getting their day in the sun. She looks like a pretty nice horse too. So excited for her. The other thing was interesting. Blood Horse ran a really great article about this, but Speed King, who won the Southwest, of course, 2 weeks ago, that horse was actually bred by the same gentleman who bred Volleyball Princess in North Carolina. Ultimately, Speed King is a Kentucky bred, but spent a lot of his time growing up in North Carolina. So strong North Carolina connection there for a horse that's on the Kentucky Derby trail. Like I said, really cool story. If you haven't checked it out already, make sure to look at that Blood Horse article about the big weekend for North Carolina, because there's a very, very touching story about the grand dam of Volleyball Princess and named Family Affair, and how that family line almost came to an end, and that it was really a group effort to save her life at a young age. And then she went on to have a tremendous career. So really cool stuff there. Really, like I said, very cool story. These are the types of stories I love to find in the sport that a lot of people might overlook. But shout out to North Carolina for a really big weekend in the horse racing industry and on the track there. Listen, we talked about some Kentucky Derby hopefuls running this past weekend. And like I said, we got the Sam F. Davis coming up. We got the Suncoast coming up for the Oaks this weekend. That's going to be a lot of fun. And we're going to have Acacia Clement on, talk a lot about that. Can't wait for that. Can't wait for all the live coverage down at Tampa for America's Day at the Races, etc. But the news just came out that today, 373 colts, well, I shouldn't say that, 373 horses were Triple Crown nominated this year. And that is the highest mark in 8 years, about a 17% increase over the number of horses that were Triple Crown nominated last year. Leading the way, Todd Pletcher with 32 horses Triple Crown nominated. Here's the interesting thing, and Pletcher even said it. He goes, I don't really have many horses on the Derby Trail. Now, he says this as we just saw one of his horses at Gulfstream Park, River Thames, who is a New York bred, looked very impressive, beating competition by open lengths, 8-9 lengths, and earning a really big buyer speed figure down at Gulfstream Park this past weekend. That horse went 7 furlongs, might stretch out in the Fountain of Youth. So maybe Pletcher does have a horse that's a pretty serious one on the Kentucky Derby Trail. We have to wait and see. But it's interesting. Pletcher goes, listen, that additional 2 weeks, that additional 3 weeks, 5 weeks to the Belmont could really change some things for certain horses. Obviously using a horse like, using the Peter Pan, for instance, as a prep for the Belmont Stakes, something we've seen trainers like Todd Pletcher do before. So sometimes you might not have a horse that's on the Derby Trail, but you want one that's going to run in these races in the Triple Crown. Pletcher with 32, Bob Baffert has 21, Brad Cox 14, Chad Brown 13, Kenny McPeak 12. Again, this is one of the issues we have in our sport is when we talk about 5-horse races out at Santa Anita, when we talk about turf races up here in New York, because listen, it's only fair to point the target back at us sometimes and back at, NYRA to say, how many times do we see an 8-horse turf race with 4 or 5 Chad Browns in them? And it's not just that, we can't find more horses. It is just that owners go to the same group of trainers repeatedly if they want their horses to perform at the highest level. Pletcher, Baffert, Cox, Brown, McPeak, Bill Mott, etc. Those are the same names we see over and over and over and over again. And I think that's why it's useful to highlight trainers like a John Ortiz, like a Jose D'Angelo, like a Whit Beckman, when they have a horse that breaks through to show, hey, you don't need to be Todd Pletcher to have a horse that's training well enough to win a big race, that these other trainers are just as good at getting these horses ready for these big preps and big efforts. And so, like I said, going to be interesting to see. One of the fascinating things, 69 horses from Japan, Triple Crown nominated, including 6 from Japanese legend Yoshida Yahagi, who, of course, trained Forever Young and still does train Forever Young, who's getting ready for the Dubai World Cup and maybe a rematch with Sierra Leone, or I should say the Saudi Cup, and then probably the Dubai World Cup. But he has one of the horses that he nominated is a filly named Mistress, actually. So look for Yahagi in that Saudi Derby in particular to have a couple of entries there. That's in a couple of weeks, but Japan's going to use that as a little bit of a prep to get ready for the UAE Derby, because that's basically an automatic entry into the Kentucky Derby. So I know no Japan horses ever won. Forever Young was pretty close last year. I don't know if we have anybody as good as Forever Young running this year, but it is something the Japanese horses are getting a little bit closer, getting a little bit better. I know I've been a little outspoken to say I'd love to see the Japanese horses come over here and run a prep in the United States. I think that's the next step they need to take, particularly out west. That transport from Japan to California is not that difficult. You saw a horse like Mandarin Hero do this 2 years ago. You can come over and run a big race here in the United States and get your horse acclimated a little bit more. And then that trip from California to Kentucky is not as overwhelming as coming all the way from Japan to Kentucky for the Churchill Downs and for the Kentucky Derby. So going to be a lot of fun to track all of these 373 Triple Crown nominated horses, but going to be, like I said, a lot of fun this year to see all of these runners. Now, listen, the final story that I wanted to talk about is a little bit of a serious one. It has to do with decoupling down in South Florida in a Gulfstream Park. And for those of you who follow the sport closely, you're probably familiar with this story. But for those of you who may just be passing fans and you might not necessarily, follow the inside information and inside scoop on all of these stories that are happening every day, it's a really important one that affects Gulfstream Park. And it's because the organization First and Stronach Group, which owns Gulfstream Park, has wanted the horsemen down in Florida to support decoupling. Now, what is decoupling? And this has nothing to do with coupled entries, by the way. Thank God New York took care of that. Well, New York hasn't taken care of that, but we had a very antiquated rule many years ago that a husband and wife automatically were coupled. And this used to impact Katie Davis and Trevor McCarthy. We fortunately have done away with that rule. But when I say decoupling, I'm not referring to coupled entries or anything along those lines. What I'm referring to is allowing the track to operate, or allowing the area to the casino in particular here at Gulfstream Park to operate without race days. So decoupling the casino from racing. And this is extremely detrimental to racing, because if you decouple, then suddenly there's not as much need for there to be live racing going on, and you can just have the casino operating, turning a profit, and doing its thing. So Stronach wanted the horsemen to support decoupling. And there were some threats made. There were some ultimatums made in terms of, if you do support decoupling, then, we can guarantee you a certain amount of time. But if you don't, then we can't really promise you anything, et cetera, et cetera. Well, initially, the Florida horsemen said that they would support decoupling. And there's a piece of legislation in the Florida House right now that pertains to this. Now, just recently, the Florida horsemen have come out and said, absolutely not. We are opposing decoupling. And this really sets up a showdown between the horsemen of Florida and Stronach Group / First. And this is all going to play out in Tallahassee, the capital of Florida, and in that legislation, to see how this is all going to play out. So it is a fascinating dynamic that could have a huge impact on the sport in South Florida. Why? Well, here's the thing. If, let's say, the legislation passes, that decoupling passes, like I said, you have this issue where suddenly Gulfstream Park wouldn't have to provide live race days in order to operate the casino. They might not opt to run live race days, and suddenly and slowly, racing at Gulfstream Park would kind of go away. This happened a little bit with dog racing. This happened a little bit with high lie before, as well down in Florida. So we've seen this in other sports. So that's one element. Now, Stronach's made some promises to the horsemen that, like I said, they keep them afloat for 3 years potentially, but still, that's not a long time, especially with what's happening out at Santa Anita. And now, if, however, the Horseman Association and those aligned with the Horseman Association are able to defeat the legislation, and decoupling is not allowed, and that they still have to pertain to, having live race days and the casino, then you get an issue where Stronach might very well just sell the property. And there's nothing that says Stronach can't do that. And that could end racing in South Florida and end it right quick. And that is a huge, huge deal to the sport. I think we've been so focused on Santa Anita. And by the way, there was a fantastic story about the California racing in the Los Angeles Times this past weekend. Truly spectacular story, really thorough, very detailed, really got into the nitty-gritty of it, and I encourage people to seek it out. But we've been so focused on South Florida, or I should say Southern California, that we haven't really paid attention to South Florida. Listen, if Gulfstream Park goes away, that's a massive blow to our sport, because that's where all of the New York horsemen go down in the winter. And suddenly it would really, it would lead to a massive influx, I suppose, of horses at Tampa Bay Downs. Certainly that would have to carry the load of Florida racing at that point. Fairgrounds a little bit, New Orleans, obviously, Oaklawn to a lesser extent. But remember, Oaklawn doesn't have a turf course. So trainers like Chad Brown and Todd Pletcher have a lot of really good turf horses. They're not going to send them to Oaklawn. They're going to try to find, like I said, Fairgrounds, Tampa Bay Downs, things like that. So it presents a lot of unknown in our sport. And it's definitely a situation that is worth continuing to monitor as it gets closer and closer to that fight in the Florida legislature. But it's something we're going to keep you updated here on the Win Play Show, because listen, we're not just going to talk about sunshine and rainbows here. I mean, there's a lot of issues in our sport, and I feel like we need to talk about them. My very good friend Andrew Champagne always jokes, the problem in horse racing is never the problem, it's talking about the problem. And I do feel like that is often the issue, that we know that there's problems, but when we talk about it, then everybody goes, oh, well, we shouldn't talk about the problem. Well, we got to talk about these problems. We have to think through, how are we going to solve these issues, and how are we going to get this sport in a better place? It's a sport we all love. It's a sport that we all have a passion for, but there's no doubt that there are serious and legitimate challenges, and we can't just be ostriches and bury our head in the sand and act like it's not happening. So we need to be aware of what's happening in Florida. All the legislature, we need to be aware of what's happening out in Southern California with the potential sale of Santa Anita coming up in the next couple of years. Those are big issues, and those are big stories that have massive ripple effects. Whether you're a horse racing fan in England, Japan, New York, Kentucky, it doesn't matter. It has a ripple effect on all of us in the industry. So really want to make sure that we continue to pay attention to those types of stories. Well, listen, I'm going to wrap it up there for this week, but we do have a lot of great stuff coming up on the channel, whether it is Snowbirds with Acacia Clement. We're going to be getting ready for that big Saturday card at Tampa Bay Downs. Myself and Kaylee Shapiro, we're going to have a great show talking about the Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Oaks. We're going to be showing some replays from last weekend, talking a little bit about the upcoming week as well, what we took out of it, kind of some maybe renovated and updated top 5, top 6, top 7 lists. So I think, as that was a big weekend last weekend of kind of clarifying the Derby picture a little bit, clarifying the Oaks picture a little bit. So can't wait to see more of that in the coming weeks. And of course, we'll have Cap in the Card, where I go through the entire card, giving my top pick, my top value play for Saturday at Tampa Bay Downs. All right, friends, appreciate everybody tuning into this episode of the Win Play Show. Like I said, make sure to press that like and subscribe button today. My name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great, profitable day at the races, and reminding you, friends, it's now post time.